Hi, everybody. Ultimately, today I wanted to say that I believe from the point that we are born into this world, at least in the United States and maybe some other individualistic societies, we're kind of fed a lie about, what the goal of life should be. And that as someone who's an American, born in the US, and speaking from my own experience, you're born into the world and there's an expectation that you should be self-sufficient. And then at the other end of that, though, you have no ownership over anything. And what I mean by that is that being born in the world, you are not given an inherent right or inherent guarantee of access to food, water, and housing. And so, because of that, like general lack of access to those basic needs for most of humanity's survival, to then apply the expectation to individuals in those societies, such as in the United States, that you are expected to be self-sufficient and not ask for assistance and not, succumb to welfare, or not like essentially just like you need to be able to take care of yourself at the end of the day. And I just think that that's an inherent lie that we feed to kids and that we feed to people, because at the end of the day, I don't control where the water comes from. I can't grow my own food necessarily unless I own the land of which to grow the food on, or I have the means of which to grow the food on. Like, I can't build my own house without the necessary resources, and I don't have access to those resources inherently. And so, we're born into the world, and our societies don't teach us how to build a house, how to hunt, how to gather food, how to grow our own food, how to source water, how to do all of those things. They're the basic, building blocks for our own survivability. Our foundations of survivability are like food, water, housing. I'm sure some other things as well. And we don't ensure those things to kids when they're born, but then we expect them, having not assured those things to them, for them to essentially just figure it out. Figure out how to survive, you little fuck. Come up with it on your own. We're not going to tell you how to do that. We're not going to give you the means of which to how to do that. We're not going to give you land. We're not going to give you security. We're not going to give you safety of which to facilitate the means of those things. We're essentially just throwing you out into the world and saying, figure it out. Because schools don't necessarily inherently teach kids how to farm or hunt or grow or like do the basic things needed for their own survival. And I think there's a reason for that. It's because our societies provide us with all of those goods now. There's a company that will get you the food. You just have to have a means of which to trade for the food. In the same way, there's a company that'll get you water, or maybe there's a public utility that'll do the same thing. And you just have to have a means of which to pay that utility for that water. When at the end of the day, I think inherently those things should be a human right. I think you should just have access to those things for free. I don't think you should have to barter for your own survival, but that's not entirely what I'm talking about here. What I'm trying to say is that there's like an individualistic expectation of kids in the United States of which to have it all figured out, be able to survive on your own, be able to live on your own, have a job, have the means to the ends at the end of the day, and without the recognition that you need your parents when you're growing up to survive, to take care of you, hopefully. And that may not be the case for everybody. A lot of kids grow up too fast. But the expectation is that guardians are there to protect you, kind of facilitate your entry into the world, kind of facilitate your ability to survive without them later in life. And I just think it's interesting that like our society puts this pressure onto everybody that you need to be able to live alone, essentially, when for the majority of human existence we've had to rely on one another, we've had to rely on other things, we've had like at no point in I think any creature's life can they be fully self-sufficient completely entirely of their own, unless you're like a being that is made up and can like create its own energy and store its own energy and essentially interact with the universe in a way that is completely like you're just your own machine that is just built for your own survival. Like you think of a plant, and a plant has photosynthesis in which they can, absorb energy from the sun, absorb nutrients from the earth, but at the same time, like those plants are not fully self-sufficient. They require the sun, they require the earth, they require things of which to survive. We are no different. And so I guess I'm arguing against this idea of like individuality and individual survival versus a more collectivistic experience. Obviously there's certain societies in the world that live more collectivistically, and if you don't know what that term means, essentially meaning just people live in harmony together. People are expected like to live with their family for the vast majority of their lives in the same home and kind of share in that experience with one another. And I think those societies are ultimately healthier not living in one. Like I'm sure that that's somewhat hypocritical, but or naive to think. Like I'm sure they have their own problems, but at the end of the day, like there's just far too much expectation as far as like surviving on your own, when at no point has anybody ever survived on their own. Even people that would like to claim that they survived on their own or they did it on their own, there's always some other means of which they got to where they got to. Like you can't say like, well, I kill all my own food or I grow all my own food, and I go, yeah, but at the end of the day, you're still relying on a plant to grow in which to facilitate your ability to harvest vegetables or fruits or whatever the case may be. You're relying on the existence of other creatures of which to hunt and kill for their meat and their other nutritional sources of energy or whatever the case may be. At no point is anybody ever completely on their own in this universe. We all rely on another means of which to survive that is outside of ourselves. We are not a like fully self-fulfilling machine of which can essentially survive inherently without the like outside resources around us. And so at the end of the day, like to shame somebody for not having necessarily made all the right decisions, or not necessarily having all of the resources of which to facilitate their own survival, to shame people for essentially not making the right decisions, not doing the right things, for being lazy, for whatever the case may be, like I think is just wrong. And I'm sure there's just some debate there, but it's not like we teach people how to be self-sufficient outside of working for a paycheck, and that paycheck facilitates all of those needs for basic survival. But as we understand, paychecks are not so simple of which to facilitate all the means of survival. Money is not the reality that turns into all of those things, and meaning that people automatically survive just because they have money. Like there's other things outside of their control that ultimately result in their ability not to afford the basic means of their own survival. And that's where things like welfare come in. And then we shame people for accepting welfare, or we shame people for, not having figured everything out on their own, not having worked 2 jobs, not having done this, not having done that. When at the end of the day, nobody should have to do those things. Nobody should have to live in squalor for no reason. Yeah, like there's an example I'd written here of I didn't want to work, but then eventually realized that I was going to have to. There was an expectation that I had to work because how are you going to survive on your own without working? And so I succumbed, and I'm going on my job search. And I'd done this multiple times and essentially hit a barrier of like nobody would hire me. I was young, never necessarily had a job before, had no prior experience. Like I didn't work when I was 16 I didn't work when I was 16, I guess like a lot of other kids might have. And so I literally could not get entry-level retail jobs. I'd applied to the Targets, the Best Buys, the things that were in my general vicinity where I lived, and just they would not hire me at the end of the day. And I know some people will go, well, did you apply to food? And I go, no, I didn't. I had my wants. I had my basic, standards for myself. Well, I didn't want that. Not to say that anybody should be ashamed for working in food. It's just not something that I wanted to do. I had already succumbed and said, I guess I need to work and find a job. That was enough for me. But at the end of the day, I applied to plenty of different retail establishments that weren't far from my home, and nobody would hire me. Nobody, never got any calls, never got any interviews. It ultimately came down to the only times that I got jobs when I was that young was having to ask somebody for a job that was a family friend who was either a manager or something else along those ends, to facilitate my ability to have a job. And that's where for me it's just very disheartening to how can you expect people to live and be self-sustainable and be able to survive when I can't even get an entry-level job. I applied to a lot of different things. I tried, and eventually I had to just fall to nepotism. And I'm not proud of that, but at the same time, I'm not ashamed of it either, because that's what it took apparently. And so to live in a world where it's everybody tells you oh, there's plenty of jobs out there and there's all these entry-level jobs, there's always something that you can find, and it's that just wasn't inherently true for me. And it's not like I'm stupid. I had good grades, smart kid, but didn't have any prior work experience. And I don't know what else it was that ultimately was making it difficult for me to be able to get hired, to be honest. But that was my reality. And so as somebody who had all that difficulty, how was I supposed to be able to break through and work for myself if I didn't rely on someone else to give me a job? You have to be able to, and even in that circumstance, I asked somebody, and I was fortunate enough that they were able to give me that job. But for some people, you may not be fortunate enough to be able to have somebody that will just give you a job. And so what do those people do? Other than just working for themselves or starting their own business or whatever the case may be, but all of that stuff, people just shouldn't have to do. If your basic need is that you just want to survive, that should just be guaranteed to you. And it's just frustrating. It's frustrating that we live in a world in which the expectation is that you're able to take care of yourself, but none of those lessons are taught to you. And that's not even what's expected of you at the end of the day. The expectation is that you're going to work. The expectation is not that you need to learn how to survive and be able to facilitate your own needs and take care of yourself. It's that you should be able to work, because our society is not designed for people to survive. Because at the end of the day, if people lived together and they were more collectivistic and they were able to take care of one another or take part in different little jobs, or whatever the case may be, it would be hard to both maintain a farm to grow your food whilst also rearing livestock. And I'm sure farmers know this shit, taking care of all these things by yourself, especially without machinery, why do we expect our kids to grow up in a world where you're going to go out and you're going to work and that's how you're going to survive, as opposed to just saying, we just want you to survive inherently. Here's all the basic needs that you will always that you'll ever need. Because at the end of the day, the other way to do that would be to say, we're going to teach you how to grow your own food. Here's your plot of land. Here's your house. Here's access to water. All of those things are inherently guaranteed to you by being a citizen of this country. But we don't do that. We expect people to just figure it out. We just expect people to understand how to do that stuff. And it's just not that simple. You would suspect that it would be common sense, but it's not. If you've never grown anything and you were never taught how to grow anything, I'm sure as many people know that maybe watching this or have tried, you can buy a house plant and it'll die very quickly because you don't have the experience of how to take care of it. In the same way, you may have animals, you may have livestock, you may have chickens, and you may lose some of them because you don't have the experience. You don't know that they're sick. You don't know what to look out for. It takes time to learn those things. I've built what's called an aquaponics system, which has fish in that system. I've lost a lot of fish, which I'm not proud of, because I didn't know what I was doing. And now that I do know what I'm doing, at least to some degree, I haven't lost a fish since. They've all been living. They're healthy. They've spawned baby fish, which proves that I'm doing something right to some degree or another. They're in a healthier environment where they feel comfortable to be able to breed and have more fish. And all of that takes time, and all of it takes learning, and you have to teach kids that. You have to teach people in your society how to do that, and we're just not taught those things. But then again, we expect people to just be able to figure it out, be able to take care of themselves, be able to survive, pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and make it through life. We shame people who are homeless, we shame people who are on welfare, and at the end of the day, they just don't have the tools. They weren't given the tools of which to facilitate their own survival. And maybe they were, but they hit a bad string of luck. It's never so simple as to say, what happened to those people. But ultimately, in me saying all of this, I think people just need to understand that you're never going to make it completely on your own without the inputs of other people. You're going to have somebody in your life to help you survive. Whether it be your parents, whether it be your grandparents, whether it be, friends or other people in your life, whether it be, the plants that you eat or the animals that you eat, whether it be the water that you drink, all of those things, whether, in the same way, if you do have access to plenty of money and you can afford to buy whatever you want, you're still relying on other people to give you and create those goods. Just because you have the money doesn't mean that somebody else isn't on the other end of that ultimately had to work at the factory that canned or bottled the good that you ultimately end up purchasing. Someone else had to come up with the process. Someone else had to create the factory. Someone else had to create all the machinery that would ultimately, make the bottle itself for the can or the, jar or container itself. There's so many moving pieces to our societies that without other people, all we would be doing is just trying to survive individualistically. We wouldn't have accomplished any of the many things that we have in our societies without collective good, without people coming together and working together and creating these processes and creating these goods. We wouldn't have the productivity that we have now if it wasn't for collective activism. And again, to expect people to just figure it out on their own without any sort of welfare or without any sort of system giving back to them at the end of the day, it's just wrong. It's just not the way the world is. And so if you expect, or you've ever looked down on, or you've ever shamed somebody, which, like, is complete within your right to do, I would ask you to reconsider that when you look at somebody and you say, man, I would never allow myself to be in that situation. It's like, well, you didn't live that life. You had people around you. You have a good relationship with your family, potentially. You have friends in your life that would never allow you to be in that situation. You have been more fortunate by having those other people in your life, and this person just doesn't happen to have that. And that is, a society failing, because you could be that person that helps that person. You could be the start of them being able to facilitate and survive on their own. And I understand that, like, people are going to make their own decisions, and we have to respect that. And, like, you can't control people, you can't make them be a certain way. But at the end of the day, I think those people wouldn't get into those situations if there was just better expectations on us societally to make sure that nobody ever ends up in a situation like that. But anyways, as per usual, let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if you disagree. I'm just rambling here. Maybe none of this makes any sense. Maybe I went on for way too long. Let me know. Thanks.